As soon as the pandemic hit, discussion started about immunity passports. At that stage, with no vaccines, it was really about whether those who had been infected and had some form of natural immunity should be able to have more freedoms, domestically or internationally. When antibody tests came swiftly out of development and onto the market, discussions moved to, could a positive antibody test be the key to opening up freedoms for individuals who had them? As vaccine development picked up pace and trials began, conversations naturally shifted to how vaccinations could provide a gateway to regaining pre-COVID freedoms. Lots of discussions have followed and of course continue to this day about whether there may be a place for vaccine passports and what that place may be. These have two potentially distinct data foundations: the use of proof of vaccinated status or proof of recent negative test. In late February this year, when the government COVID-19 response roadmap out of lockdown was published, it referenced CSC's COVID status certification. At the end of April, it was announced that the NHS app, not the COVID-19 app, was going to be used as a vaccine passport for international travel, a digital app. With the concept of digital certification, the question arises, are vaccine passports a vehicle to digital freedom or digital control? Is digital control about surrendering our data or having no control over our data, or making an active choice to provide data in exchange for freedom? What's going to follow is a hop, skip and a jump through, instead of from A to Z, from V to T, as we dance through the letters of vaccine passport to explore some of the issues raised by them and whether they might be a form of digital freedom or digital control. How viable does a vaccine passport scheme need to be acceptable? There is an existing legal framework for such a scheme internationally in the form of the World Health Organization International Health Regulations. Currently, this is only used for yellow fever, and proof of vaccination when coming from an area where yellow fever is endemic can be shown, and if someone has this, it cannot be a reason to refuse them entry to the country. Interestingly, we know that yellow fever vaccine provides long-lasting immunity. But nationally, we do not have an existing legal framework, so one would need to be created. Would the creation of a domestic legal framework be perceived as a move towards digital freedom or control, or neither? Does viability depend on sufficient uptake of vaccines? Does the spectre of needing a vaccine passport encourage uptake? Could a desire for freedom be driving people towards a form of digital control? In April 2021, Ipsos completed a poll for the World Economic Forum on global views on personal health data and vaccine passports. It's interesting to pause and consider the inclusion of the words personal health data in the title. We live in the era of big data. We knew that before COVID, and to an extent that's just been expanded and enhanced in the last year as most of us have existed in our homes in front of various size screens, living digital lives. Vaccine passports are empty vessels without the personal health data that sits behind them. Therefore, one of the issues to grapple with, which is a constant issue in the 21st century, is how much we each wish to protect our own personal health data. Exploring the data from the Ipsos survey can help us to understand the appetite for vaccine passports, both global appetite and domestic appetite. Across 28 countries, 78% of participants agreed that vaccine passports should be required to enter their country. Honing in on the domestic picture, 84% of participants surveyed in Great Britain agreed that all travellers entering Great Britain should be required to have a vaccine passport. On effectiveness, 74% agreed that they would be effective in making travel and large events safe. 72% agreed that all large public venues, such as concert halls and stadiums, should require a vaccine passport. And 55% agreed that shops, restaurants and offices should require a vaccine passport. In terms of level of comfort about allowing your doctor to have access to personal health data, 90% of vaccination data, 90% agreed that they would be comfortable or very comfortable or somewhat comfortable with that. For allowing your employer access, this dropped to 62%. And for allowing government access, this dropped to 60%. Freedoms that many of us have taken for granted have been heavily restricted during the pandemic to address the public health emergency that we face. But what does this mean for civil liberties? Are vaccine passports a means by which freedoms can be restored? Would a vaccine passport digital app provide a form of digital freedom? Or are they unnecessary because the fact of vaccination itself should be sufficient to restore freedoms, especially with the high vaccine uptake that we are seeing? Is needing to demonstrate your vaccinated status a step too far? One thing is for sure, as we move to our second C, is that communication relating to any vaccine passport scheme would benefit from being very clear and consistent in its messaging to help people to trust and buy into and want to use such a scheme. Communications would rely on clarity. Clarity is the purpose and scope of any vaccine passport scheme and the underlying data used to populate it. Clarity around the practicalities of how to obtain a vaccine passport, where to use it, and guidance and tools and information for gatekeepers, such as businesses, venues, airports. Clarity around privacy, clear privacy notices, what it means for someone's privacy, where the data will be stored, who will have access to it, the duration of the requirement for a vaccine passport. Behavioural scientist input has been mission critical during COVID times, and of course it has a role to play in communication if there were to be a vaccine passport. But of course uptake of a scheme can also occur through incentivising the vaccination to enable access to a vaccine passport by limiting what can be accessed without one. For example, if the position were taken that no vaccine passport were required to access places that people need to access, doctors' surgeries, shops, food shops, that kind of thing, but that one would be required to access places that people want to access or may want to access, such as theatres, pubs, nightclubs, or even a protest. By encouraging vaccine uptake, does such a scheme come markedly close to effectively mandating vaccines because the price of not having one is too high if it limits your freedoms? And where does that leave people who do not want to have the vaccine or cannot have the vaccine? Are vaccine passports necessary? Is there a necessity for them? What about for those who are exempt? Exemptions for necessity reasons, for example, for those for whom a vaccination is not medically recommended. How do they evidence that without revealing health information that they might not want to? Does how necessary they are depend on whether they're being used in a domestic or an international setting? It also depends on vaccine efficacy. How effective are vaccines at protecting those vaccinated? It looks positive, but the evidence is still emerging on this. Can fully vaccinated people still transmit the virus to others? What about the efficacy of vaccines on variants and the efficacy of vaccines over time? If the informational foundations on which such a scheme would be built are not solidified, then is it too soon to build that scheme? Or on the contrary, if we wait longer, will the need for such a scheme have dissipated? This is about timing. Or is it about creating a system with sufficient flexibility, but with a clear endpoint? In April 2021, the World Health Organization said it was too early to know the duration of protection of COVID-19 vaccines. If boosters are needed and they are again rolled out in priority order domestically, then could there become tiers of vaccine passports? Or could vaccine passports be revoked, digitally or otherwise, if those who have had their double vaccination opt to not have any subsequent booster dose that might be recommended? What are the privacy ramifications of such a scheme? Just recently, the NHS app was updated to include a Share Your COVID-19 Status section. The privacy notice was headed How the COVID Status Certificate Uses Your Data and What Your Rights Are. It confirms that it is central government, the Department of Health and Social Care, that is providing the service, not the NHS. It makes it clear that this service will allow residents in England to display either electronically via a smartphone or manually on paper, their COVID vaccination history. There is some choice there as to digital or paper. It further states that as the country resumes normal functions, this data will be useful for further aspects of unlocking as they arise for international travel or attendance at domestic events once these have been permitted by government policy and guidance. Under the heading of personal data we collect and how it is used, there is a list of personal data, which, as might be expected, includes full name, date of birth, NHS number. However, it also lists other personal data, including vehicle registration number, national insurance number, employer details, information relating to family, individual's lifestyle, genetic or biometric details, and criminal convictions or alleged criminal behaviour. None of this latter list is marked for use in the certificate, so why is it included? Is digital control providing or allowing linkages with this level of data, or is this the price worth paying for digital freedom? How do we ensure accuracy of data? Does additional linking with other data help? Is accuracy improved by a digital app? Is there also an unknown at the moment about the accuracy of protection from vaccines? How long will vaccinated protection last, and what about variants? How do we ensure that adequate controls are in place relating to our data in exchange for providing this data or allowing it to determine our freedoms? What settings domestically might vaccine passports be required for? Just large venues and events? Test events have been happening, sporting, raves, gigs, the Brit Award, but these have been accessible with a COVID test, not a vaccine passport. Is this not sufficient? There's also a big question about workplaces. Will they be needed for work? In which case, could that effectively mandate vaccines for work? The current consultation on whether vaccination should be made a condition of deployment from workers in older adult care homes raises some key issues which are effectively a microcosm to some of the issues that could arise when determining which settings vaccine passports might apply to and how. Who should be covered? Is it just those who provide direct care? What about those who visit care homes, hairdressers, faith leaders, GPs? Should exemptions be allowed on medical grounds? How would that be demonstrated? How would disclosure be made? And who would be responsible for such a scheme? The consultation also asked key stakeholders how they would like to present this information. Could vaccine passports become a wider condition of employment more generally, like a right to work check? And what does that mean for those who can't or don't want to have the vaccine because they are not mandatory? And who might that exclude, and how could that exacerbate, or could it exacerbate existing social exclusion and discrimination? Any scheme would need to have a clear scope and defined uses. This would vitiate against any potential digital control concerns relating to scope creep and what further information might potentially be sought under such a scheme. The public sector equality duty would benefit from being writ large in this process to ensure that this scheme has equality built into its design. How long will a passport scheme be here for? There could be a small window until we have a sufficiently vaccinated population to make the need for vaccine passports obsolete quite quickly. So is it worth the investment financially, ethically, legally and technologically to develop when it could be so short-lived? Will there be primary legislation which is debated? Do we need a clear endpoint, the sunset clause? And what about consideration of extended use as purposes? What if we have another pandemic, hopefully not, or a virulent flu, or booster jabs for COVID? Is this only acceptable in a public health emergency? And what about when that passes? How do we measure when that passes and therefore is no longer needed? If there is not a clear endpoint, does it slip into digital control? There is a paper option, but presumably this may require some form of photo ID, a bit like can already happen with nightclubs or some venues pre-COVID. But could it be based on other forms of information, not just vaccination, so a PCR test or an antigen testing? And could there be a range of data points? And what about just event-specific passports rather than a constant passport? Would that not be a more proportionate and realistic approach, especially until all adults have been offered the vaccine? Could vaccine passports mean that we act as though we can do anything once fully vaccinated, a gateway to all freedoms? Is this the right approach? Safe if have the passport, unsafe if don't. But what if you are fully vaccinated and do not want a passport? What then? You've arguably done your bit by getting vaccinated. Is that not enough? What if vaccination is not the full shield we all hope it is, and people comply with this scheme and then get ill? What are the legal ramifications or potential lawsuits, perhaps? The Royal Society called for vaccine passports to be internationally standardised. If this happens, this will likely take some time. And what about sharing of health data across countries, where some may have limited data protection rules? Vaccine passports seem more of an inevitability for international travel. However, the World Health Organization do not currently recommend proof of COVID-19 vaccination as a condition of departure or entry for international travel, but they are consulting on interim guidance on developing a smart vaccination certificate. There are already barriers in place for travel. Some countries have tight border restrictions, or you need tests, etc., to enter them. But what about countries that do not currently have access to vaccines in volumes? What would the impact of a general requirement of a vaccine to travel mean for populations where they haven't been able to access vaccines yet, or even for refugees in terms of that freedom of travel? Or actually, could it conversely make travel more accessible by reducing the costly elements in relation to testing that are currently required? How do we measure the success of vaccine passports? By take-up, by sign of economic recovery, in certain areas where big events provide taxable income and jobs, by signs of well-being recovery, by people being able to enjoy live music or live sporting events again, things that people haven't been able to during the pandemic, by the infection rate. Wouldn't the true sign of success be where they are no longer required? Or would success look like a scheme that protects privacy and is as data light as possible, has the most options available and has a clear endpoint? Would it be the deletion of vaccine passports and the digital data and control that goes with them and return to full, previously often taken for granted, freedoms? Has the pandemic reinforced that control and freedom coexist? Neither bad nor good, perhaps, just two halves of the same Bitcoin in a digital world. There is so much more to say on this topic, but we will have to leave it there. Digital freedom or digital choice, you decide.